let's analyze today's topic, that is electoral bonds. So this topic has been appeared in the news as an editorial in the Hindu newspaper, that is an invitation to corruption. We all know that the electoral bond has been introduced in order to bring the transparency in the election or the political funding. So how it is leading to a corruption, or it has become an invitation to the corruption. So that's what this article is talking about. So we should be analyzing what is electoral bond, why it has been introduced, its benefits, and the other analysis of the related topics. So the news has been appeared because in order to cleanse the system of the political funding in the country, and in keeping with the government's desire to move to the cashless economy, the government has introduced this electoral bond scheme. So here this term has become very significant, and I will tell you why. That is cashless economy, and this topic comes under our civil service GS paper 2 for the mains, and it includes the salient features of the Representation of the People's Act, and further the government's policies and intervention for the development in various sectors and issues arising out of their design and implementation. So we will be analyzing this government intervention and its issues and the various significance and issues in the design and the significance of this reforms that is introduced by the government. And along with or in relation to this electoral bond topic, you should also be focusing on the electoral trust and the Election Commission of India, its functioning, and the political parties and their recognition as the national parties and the state parties, and the money bill, because these terms has been comes or mentioned in this article. Now let's start with a prelims practice question. So here consider the following statement regarding the electoral bonds. So the first statement given that it is a bearer instrument like the promissory note, and it can be purchased at any time and can be redeemed within 15 days. And only RBI and the public sector banks are authorized to issue the electoral bonds. And which of the above statements given are correct? So A is 1 only, B is 1 and 2 only, then C is all of the above, and D is 1 and 3 only. So let's get into the analysis and get the final answer at the end of the discussion. So the electoral bond, that is the nature of the electoral bond, is that it is a bearer instrument in the nature of the promissory note. So the first statement of the given question becomes true. Then it is a interest free banking instrument. Let's analyze the eligibility to buy the or to enroll for the electoral bonds. And a citizen of India or a body incorporated in India can buy the electoral bond, and on fulfillment of all extant KYC norms. So KYC is the know your customer norms. So any citizen of India who fulfills this KYC norm can buy the electoral bond, and by making a payment from the bank account only. So which means that he cannot pay the money through cash, and he can pay this only through the electronic means of transfer, which means cashless. So that's how the electoral bond is making the political funding cashless. So that's the significance. I told you earlier that the word cashless economy in the earlier time. Now let's analyze the lifespan. So its lifespan is only for the 15 days. Once it is issued, it has to be redeemed within this 15 days of this issue of the electoral bonds. And further, it can be used for making donation only to the political parties registered under the 29A of the Representation of the People's Act, and it will be redeemed into the political account of the political party only. So the individuals cannot redeem this bonds. Then the period of the purchase, and it's available for the purchase for a period of 10 days each in the months of the January, April, July and October, as may be specified by the government. So it is not available throughout the year, only for the 10 days in the quarters, that also in the first 10 days of the each quarter. And it can be the multiples of the thousands as 1000, 10,000 up to 1 crore. Then available from the specified branches of the State Bank of India only. So here the RBI is not included. So that statement in the question become wrong. Now let's analyze the electoral bond and what it is. So an electoral bond is designed to be a bearer instrument like the promissory note in effect, and it will be similar to the bank note, that is payable to the bearer on the demand and free of interest. So the electoral bond doesn't have any interest. Also, it is tax exempted from the side of the government. So these are the two features with respect to the electoral bonds that become significant for the prelims examination. Then it can be purchased by any citizen of India or a body incorporated in India. Now let's analyze the benefits of the electoral bond, and it will bring substantial transparency in the political donation against the present system of contribution in the election funding mechanism. And how much, so how much funding comes, what kinds of funding it is, and the source of the fundings were and where it will be spent will be known clearly. So this is not an exactly the same way is happening with the electoral bond system, and we will explain it why. Then the non-disclosure of the recipients will ensure that people free to donate to any political party of their choice, and it will reinforce the idea of moving away from the cash system towards a clean money which check system could not achieve. So that's how the electoral bond will achieve a cashless economic system, and it is having a maturity period of the 15 days. So between buying and selling will ensure that they don't turn into a parallel economy. So only within this 15 days it has to be turned or it has to be redeemed. So it cannot exist for a long time to act as a parallel economy, just like the black money is existing. Now let's analyze the benefits of the electoral bond. So it is makes transparency in the political funding, because all transactions are carried out through the banks, and that is through the accounts. Then the protecting the donor from the harassment. So if a party A is donating into a political party, say X, then the opposing party Y may target this person because he is supporting this party. So as there is the anonymity, it can protect the donor from any of the harassment from the other party, and the non-disclosure of the information to the third parties. Then achieving digital India vision, because the transaction will be cashless. So it can help India to achieve its vision of the digital economy and the digital India. Then bringing donations under the tax purview, because all the transactions are carried through the bank and it will be subject to the tax purview. Now let's analyze how to use this electoral bonds. So the bonds will be issued in the multiples from the thousands up to 1 crore, and will be available at the specified branches of the State Bank of India, and they can be brought by the donor with the KYC compliant account. Then the donor can donate the bond to their party of choice, which can then be cashed via the party's verified account within this 15 days. So this is how the electoral bond is working. Now let's analyze the other conditions to buy this electoral bonds. And every party that is registered under the section 29A of the Representation of the People Act 1951 and has secured at least 1% of the vote polled in the most recent Lok Sabha or the state election will be allotted a verified account by the Election Commission of India. So here you should be noting 2 points. The first one, they should secure at least 1% of the vote in the recent Lok Sabha election or in the state election. So both are the same limit of 1%. And the second one, this account is being verified by the Election Commission of India and not by the RBI. So often the UPSC makes such replacement. and it may be confusing. So here you should be very careful that the bank account will be verified and is being given by the election commission, and only to this verified account they can redeem the money. Then the electoral bond transactions can be made only via this account. And further, the bond will be available for the purchase for a period of 10 days each in the beginning of the every quarter, that is from January, April, July and October for the 10 days. An additional period of 30 days shall be specified only during the time of the Lok Sabha election. So that's why the news has appeared in the newspaper, because the Lok Sabha election is going to be held in 2019 and the government is planning to give this 30 days of extension for buying this electoral bond for financing the electoral funding. Now let's analyze the challenges and the concerns related to the electoral bonds. The first one is that even the foreign money can come and even a dying company can give money now. So this was not the provision, or this was not the condition earlier, and there is no ceiling on the party expenditure and the election commission cannot monitor it. So as long as the party doesn't have a ceiling on the electoral expenses, the Election Commission of India cannot expense the monitor. So at present, the Election Commission of India can monitor only the individual expenses, and there is no mechanism to ensure that what is coming is not the black money, as there is secrecy of the donor. So only with the court procedure or through the concerned investigating officer or the agency, the secrecy or the identity of the donor can be exposed. In other terms, the identity of the donor remains anonymity. And further, the scheme allows for complete anonymity of the donor. Neither the purchaser of the bond nor the political party receiving the donation is mandated to disclose the donor's identity. So this creates still a playground for the black money, and the black money can be involved. So here the black money has been only channelized through a banking system and nothing has been changed. And therefore, not only will say the shareholders of the corporation be unaware of the company's contribution, but the voters too will have no idea of how and through whom the political party have received the fund. So in cases of a company, its shareholders should have the complete knowledge or the complete data of how the money has been allotted. But if any of the donor or any of the topmost decision maker of this company is making any of the contribution into a political party, then his name and his identity will be remain unknown, and this company's shareholders won't be having any idea of to what party they are or to what party he is making this contribution. And this may be sometimes against the interest of the shareholders of the company. And if the company doesn't want to interfere in the political decision or in the political funding. And the second one is the voters or the people. So they may be having no idea of how this political party is getting this money and who is contributing them or who is supporting them. Sometimes the political parties may be getting this from the corporations or the corporates. This corporation may be coming from this corporates. So this may be lead to a crony capitalism. So there should be a transparency in, or the identity of the donor should be exposed or has to be revealed. And moving forward, the program removes an existing condition that had prohibited the companies from donating anything more than the 7.5%. So this limit has been there in the earlier system. Now this has been taken away. And the 7.5% of their average net profit over the previous 3 years. So when this conditions has been removed, this now means that even the loss-making entities can make an unlimited contributions. And further, it leads to the creation of the shell companies. Then the requirement that the corporation ought to have been in existence for at least 3 years before it could make a political donation has not been or has been removed. So this may lead to shell companies forming solely for the purpose of political donation. So the electoral bonds has been constituted in order to prevent this shell companies and to bring transparency, and both of these objectives of the electoral reforms or the electoral bonds has not been met because of the flaws in the scheme or the way it has been implemented. And moving forward, as petition filed in the Supreme Court points out that the scheme suffers from at least two fundamental defects. The first one, how the scheme has been implemented, is a concern, and the second one, it impacts the fundamental right of the voters or the citizen, that is the right to information. The first one, it was incorporated on the back of a series of amendments made to the legislation, including the Representation of the People's Act, the Income Tax, and the Companies Act, which were introduced in the form of money bill, and the two, that the scheme floats a number of fundamental rights. So this is how the first one, how the bill has been introduced, is controversial, and the second one, it impacts the fundamental right. So, prima facie, it appears that the scheme cannot really deliver whatever it was intended to. So, let's analyze the issues in introducing the electoral bonds as an executive action. We know that under the Article 110, the Constitution allows the speakers to classify a proposed legislation as the money bill, and only when the draft law deals with all or any of the subjects enlisted in this provision. So, when this electoral bond has been introduced, it has amended many of the provisions that has been earlier introduced as money bill, and this subject comprises a set of 7 features, that is under the Article 110, which gives the 7 features for a bill to be classified as money bill, which includes the items such as imposition of tax, the regulation of the borrowing of the money by the government, then the custody of the Consolidated Fund of India or any of the expenditure to be made from this Consolidated Fund of India, that is the appropriation of money out of Consolidated Fund of India, and any matter incidental to the subject explicitly mentioned in this Article 110. So the issue is that it is impossible to see how the provision pertaining to the electoral bond scheme couldn't possibly fall within any of these categories, that is the Finance Act, through which this amendments were introduced. So we have earlier noticed that the electoral bond has been introduced by making amendments into the many of the finance bills and the money bills. So if such an amendment has to be made, then the electoral bond has to be introduced through the legislative process. But the electoral bond has been introduced in the budgetary speech and through an executive action, and there is no legislative action. So this is why the executive action which introduced this electoral bond is criticized. Now let's analyze how this electoral bond violates this fundamental right. So in the absence of complete knowledge about the identity of those funding the various different parties, it is difficult to conceive how a citizen can meaningfully participate in the political or the public life. We know that in case of the electoral bonds, the identity of the donor remains anonymous. So in such cases, and the second one, how this political party is getting the fund also remains anonymous. So both of this decides the right to choice or the to make a wise choice of the voters. So without the transparency and without the knowledge of the about these two factors, the voters cannot make the right choice, and it is difficult to conceive how the citizens can meaningfully participate in the political decision making or electing a party who is having a right or a righteous stand. Then when the power of that vote is diluted through the opacity in the political funding, the democracy as a whole loses its intrinsic value. So here the vote of the or the vote value of the individual or the public has been reduced because of the lack of transparency in this political funding, and that is lead to the democracy as a whole has lost its intrinsic value. Now let's make a critical analysis of this issue. So it is imperative that not only the company's shareholders but electors too must know how the party is being financed. So in order to this, the identity of the donor has to be revealed. Then a democracy couldn't function unless the voter had free and complete access to information about the parties for which they were going to vote. Then a breakdown principle of the democracy is that the public action ought to be guided by the transparency and the fairness. So when we are considering the basic principles of the democracy, the transparency and the fairness comes the foremost. So for that, rather than giving the identity or the protection to the donor, the transparency and the fairness in the democracy has to be upheld. Now let's come back to the prelims question that we have discussed earlier. So here the statement given were it is a bearer instrument like the promissory note. So this is correct. Then it can be purchased at any time. No, it cannot be purchased. It can be purchased at the 10 days from the first 10 days of each quarter. So it cannot be purchased at any time, but it can be redeemed within the 15 days. And only this RBI or the not the public sector bank, only the SBI and some of its approved branches can issue the electoral bonds. So this two statement goes wrong and the correct answer is option A. So let's get into the explanation. The electoral bond is a financial instrument. So we have already discussed this, and it is similar to the promissory note, yes, and for making donation to the political parties. And there is issued by, or these are being issued by the scheduled commercial bank upon the authorization from the central government to intending donors, but only against the check and the digital payment, and it cannot be purchased by paying cash. That is, the digital transaction only can be carried out in order to purchase the electoral bonds. Then these bonds shall be redeemed or redeemable in the designated accounts of the registered political party within this prescribed time limit. So this time limit is the 15 days from the issue of the bonds. And further, it is an interest-free banking instrument issued on the non-refundable basis. So once this electoral bond is issued, then only it can be redeemed into a political party's account, and the one who has purchased this electoral bond cannot be redeemed. That is, this is non-refundable. And further, no loan would be provided against these bonds. In other cases, the bonds issued by the banks or the RBI can be used as collaterals and the loans can be issued. But in case of the electoral bonds, no loans can be issued as it is only a means for the political funding. Now let's come to the mains practice question. So over the years, every effort has been made to endorse the opacity in the political funding. Then the electoral bond scheme, which represents the latest such assault. Analyze. So here you should be making how this electoral bond, which is intended to bring transparency, but how it has ended to bring opacity in the system, and how it is blocking or how it is hindering the functionings of the political transparency and the transparency in the electoral financing. And at the end, as the direction what is analyzed, you could give a fair conclusion and a suggestion, a way forward in order to improve, and the suggestions to improve the electoral bonds. So with this, we are coming to the conclusion of the end of the discussion of this topic. The next topic, that is the Habitual Offenders Act. So let's analyze why it has been appeared. So today there has been an article, an editorial, that is in this trauma, which talks about this Habitual Offenders Act. So why this is in news? It is because following the 1857 mutiny, which has the participation of the tribal groups, 239 castes and the tribes were given criminal by birth tag under the ambit of the Criminal Tribes Act of the 1937 by the Britishers. Then after independence, the Indian government replaced this act with the Habitual Offenders Act of 1952. But far from this easing their life, the new act only re-stigmatized the marginalized tribes. So that is the new criticism or the criticism against this Habitual Offenders Act, and it has not made any differences into this Criminal Tribes Act of 1937, which has been introduced by the Britishers. Even though that has been repealed, this act also leads to the same consequences that the CTA Act of 1937 has brought into the life of the tribes. Now the topics comes under GS paper 2, that is welfare schemes for the vulnerable sections of the population by the sender and the state, and the performance of the schemes, mechanisms, laws, institutions and bodies constituted for the protection and betterment of these vulnerable sections. Now let's analyze the Habitual Offenders Act. So a habitual offender or the repeat offender is a person convicted of a new crime who was previously convicted of the same or any of the crimes. Then various states and the jurisdictions may have laws targeting habitual offenders and specifically providing for the enhanced or the exemplary punishment or other sanctions. So who is this denotified tribes related to this Habitual Offenders Act? So denotified and the nomadic tribes can be traced to the Criminal Tribes Act, which is introduced by the Britishers in 1871. Then the colonial government notified nearly 200 tribal communities to be hereditary criminals, that is criminal by birth, cementing their societal identity as outcast and subjecting them to the constant harassment by the administrators. Then after India gained independence, these tribes were denotified from the list of the criminal tribes, and hence the term has been given, that is denotified tribes, who was earlier being part of this 200 tribal communities which is notified under this Criminal Tribes Act of the Britishers. So why they were notified as criminal tribes? It is because there are several reasons that can be ascribed to state sanctioned stigmatization of this denotified tribes in India under this British rule, and it includes the strategy to identify their allies and at the same time subdue and monitor the activities of the rebellious tribal communities in India. So we have already learned that it has been introduced after 1857, which is the first war of independence. So in this first war of independence, there has been participation from the tribal groups, and in order to prevent any of such uprisings, the government has notified the tribes as the criminal tribes by birth, so that the Britishers can take actions against the tribal communities if they're trying to protest against the Britishers. Now let's analyze the implications of this Criminal Tribes Act on the life of the tribes. So this Criminal Tribes Act allowed for a close supervision and the control over the mobility of the tribes, which were notified by the provincial governments. So their mobility has been impacted, and further there has been a serious attack from the side of the both civil society and from the administrators. Then the act was amended in 1897, 1908 and in 1911 to give sweeping powers to the authorities, and the atrocities of this authority has been carried on the tribes, and some of these amendments were draconian, as allowing the state to remove any child of the age of 6 and above from its criminal parents. And further, by 1927, certain provisions were amended and the act was finally applicable to the whole British India, along with the introduction of laws such as the Forest Act and the Salt Act. The British threw a noose around the lives of the denotified tribes using the stringent regulation. So, with first of all this Criminal Tribes Act, there has been identified or stamped as criminals, and further under this Forest Act, their right to livelihood has been taken away, and the salt tax has imposed restrictions on the producing salt, and this has impacted their livelihood. So, with all this act, the Britishers has made the lives of the tribals miserable. Now, let's take the actions, or let's look into the actions taken by the government. So, it is only in the independent India that the need was felt to shift the collective burden of the criminality that has been imposed upon these tribes by the Britishers, and which has led to the Criminal Tribes Act being repealed and the Habitual Offenders Act being enacted in various states. Now let's analyze the concerns with the Habitual Offenders Act. Then the 15 crore individuals, approximately 15 crore individuals, better known as denotified tribes of India, continue to be considered as criminal by birth. And however, the Habitual Offenders Act functioned as a mere extension of this Criminal Tribes Act. Nomadic and the semi-nomadic communities continued to face harassment at the hands of law enforcement agencies. So the Criminal Tribes Act has or empowered this enforcement agencies to take actions against the tribal community. But the Habitual Offenders Act doesn't have such stringent provision. But still, using this Habitual Offenders Act, the enforcement agencies are harassing the tribal communities, which means even though the law has been changed, the condition or the life of the tribals has not been changed. And further, certainly the mere repeal of the Criminal Tribes Act could not change the mindset of the government officials or the members of the society. The fact is that even in the 21st century, these denotified tribes continue to face the ostracization by the society at large. Now, let's analyze the issues faced by the denotified tribes. Given their centuries-old tradition of the constant movement, they often do not possess any residential proof, which leave them out of the majority of the government's developmental schemes. So they are not able to access this developmental or the various other social security schemes being given by the government under different times. Now further, those deemed eligible for such schemes were randomly grouped under the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, or the OBC, that is other backward classes. Then as a result, most number of the denotified tribes continue to be out of the orbit of such steps being taken to end the discrimination. So this denotified tribes usually didn't get any of the benefits that is being extended to the other categories. Then let's analyze some of the earlier recommendations that has been made by various communities to repeal this Habitual Offenders Act. So the National Human Rights Commission has recommended to repeal the Habitual Offenders Act in 1952, that is soon after the independence. In March 2007, the UN's Committee on the Elimination of the Racial Discrimination said that the so-called denotified and the nomadic people, which are listed for their alleged criminal tendencies under the Formal Criminal Tribals Act of 1871, continue to be stigmatized under the habitual offenders, and asked India to repeal this Habitual Offenders Act and rehabilitate this denotified and the nomadic tribes. Now let's analyze the way forward, or how and what we have to do with this habitual offenders. So a mere repeal of the law will not address their need for re-establishing society-wide changes to gain access to the political, social, economic welfare. Thus, the repeal of the Habitual Offenders Act has to be accompanied by a slew of the legal reforms. So mere repealing of this Habitual Offenders Act won't make any change. There has to be some legal reforms to give protection to the denotified tribe communities to address the multitude of the issues that has been faced by this TNT or the denotified tribal community. And further, their unique lifestyle requires positive affirmation and the development policies that cater to their long-standing and the overlooked needs. So this has to be addressed. Then it should be the duty of the government to be proactive and reach out to the denotified tribes, since the latter would understandably refrain from seeking the state helps, because the denotified tribes try to remain isolated and away from the society, and they won't be coming to the state for the help. So it is the state has to take the proactive step to engage with the denotified tribes. Now let's take a practice question for the mains. So the question states that the Habitual Offenders Act of 1952, far from easing their, that is the denotified tribes' life, only re-stigmatized and marginalized the tribes. So here you should analyze the history of this Habitual Offenders Act and how it still have this stigmatized view and the impact on the lives of the tribal community. And next you should give the way forward and how it has to be addressed. Then you can conclude the answer with a well-balanced conclusion. So with this, we are concluding the discussion on this Habitual Offenders Act, and we will be discussing the next topic. The next topic, that is US-China relation. So an article titled Uneasy Truths has been appeared in the today's The Hindu newspaper. So the US action against the top Hawaii executive threatens the tariff tow between the US and the China. We know that in recent times the US and China has come in terms to end or at least to have a truce between their trade war. So in this circumstances, this truce has been only for a 90 days. And meanwhile, the US has taken action against this top Hawaii executive who is from the China and against this Chinese company, and this can seriously impact this 90 days reconciliation or the talks between the US and China, and it can further lead to strengthening or the serious impact on the talk between the China and the US and further worsen the present trade war, and it will intensify this trade war, and this will be having a serious impact on the global economy and impact on the India. So this comes under the GS paper 2, that is effect of policies and the politics of this developed and the developing countries on India's interest and its impact on the India and the Indian diaspora. So let's analyze the issue and its impact. So the 90 days trade truce between the China and the United States reached over the weekend on the sidelines of this G20 meeting in the Argentina in Buenos Aires, and it is already proving to be fragile because of the various disputes that has been arising since then, rather than going for a reconciliation or into a peaceful path. Then the Chinese telecommunication giant Huawei's chief financial officer was arrested recently by a Canadian authority, and this has been following the extradition request from the US. And further, the arrest happens around the time the US President Donald Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping meet at Buenos Aires to diffuse the trade tensions between their countries. So such actions of the US is going to worsen any of this peace talks. Then the market across the world were negatively affected because of this, and as the trade tensions looked to flare up once again between this world's two largest economy. Now let's analyze the reason for the arrest. So the Hawaii at this moment has been accused of breaching this America's sanction against Iran, and further the second accusation is that the US lawmakers have also been concerned about the Chinese government using the company to carry out spying operations on the foreign soil. So based on these two grounds, the US has arrested the Hawaii chief. And further, it is hard to determine whether the present US action against this Hawaii official is based on the legitimate concern. So even though the US is saying that it has arrested this person on spying on the US or on the US systems, we don't know how much legitimate this concern of the US is and how the China is going to take it. Then about this national security of the US, and has simply attacked China on yet another front of the ongoing trade war, and how the China is going to retaliate has to be wait and seen. Then other countries including this Australia, United Kingdom have also been quite worried about doing business with the Hawaii due to the alleged gathering of the intelligence by the company. So which shows that this company has been spying in the foreign countries. And further, they fear that this Hawaii's involvement in building their 5G network could lead to problems linked to this cyber espionage. So the China has been expanding its economic and the technological might through the investment, and the Hawaii is also providing this 5G connectivities in different countries. So the different countries have expressed their concern that this facility of the Hawaii company may be leading to the espionage, especially in the cyber field. Now let's analyze the impact of this arrest. So this radical anti-Chinese politicians in the US have every reason to exaggerate national security concerns simply in order to justify the protectionist sanctions that they have imposed against these Chinese companies. We know that the trade war between US and China has been triggered because of this protectionist regime or the protectionist policies that has been taken by the US, and further retaliation from the side of the China. And now the China may take this arrest in order to justify their stand on imposing this protectionist sanction. Then Hawaii has clearly been seen by many as a serious threat to the global domination exerted by the American technology companies. And further, Either way, the recent actions are bound to have a negative impact on the US-China trade ties, as the China will not be too happy about the continuing assault on the multinational companies which have their roots in China. And the China may be retaliating against this US action against these Chinese multinational companies. And the US concerns about the national securities are also closely related to the accusation of against the Huawei violating this intellectual property rights. And moving forward, the arrest might thus suggest that the US may not go soft on its demand for the arrest might thus suggest that the US may not go soft on its demand for the protection of the intellectual property rights. So with this arrest, the US can further strengthen its demand for the strong protection of the intellectual property right regimes during this talk with the Chinese authorities in the next few months. Then with this rapid escalation in the trade tensions over the years, it will take serious effort to bring a lasting solution that is acceptable to both American and the Chinese politician. Now, with this practice question, let's conclude this topic. So the question is that more than trade, the current trajectory of the relationship between the world's two major economies, that is US and China, intersect on the several issues. So discuss the areas of the confrontation between the two and its likely impact on the India. So here you should be mentioning the various issues that is at presently confronting the US and the China trade, then intellectual property rights and the economic might and its shift in the policies like Asia pivot policy of the US and the Belt and Road initiative of the China in order to extend its might into the Asia Pacific region. So this all has been comes in confrontation with each other. So and further you could have a discussion on the how it is going to impact on the India and its impact especially in the Indian Ocean region. And you could make a or you could make suggestions how India has to balance between this and what steps India has to take. So with this we are coming to the conclusion of today's discussion.